Do you know how World War I gets boiled down to that one gunshot in Sierra? Most people point to a single trigger. Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets popped. A shot fired, alliances activated, and suddenly millions were dead in trenches across Europe. But the truth, that gunshot was only the spark. The real ignition came from ledger books, not bullets. Somewhere between London and New York, a handful of powerful bankers were scribbling loans worth billions in today's money, effectively turning a Balkan dispute into the deadliest conflict humanity had ever seen. And here's the kicker. They funded both sides. Stick around because by the end you will see why your history textbook skipped this, and how echoes of this financial machinery still shape wars today. Let's rewind to 1914. Europe was a powder keg. Nationalism was surging, militaries flexing, and yes, the assassination lit the fuse. But peel back the propaganda, and you find something far more sinister. A financial arms race decades in the making. Empires drowning in debt from colonial expansion. Gold standards groaning under the weight of industrial ambition. A web of secret treaties not about borders but bottom lines. Britain and France, the old colonial giants sitting at top vast holdings in Africa and Asia. They were siphoning rubber, oil, and cotton to fuel their factories. But all that power came at a cost. Debt piled up, often financed by private banks. Germany, the industrial newcomer, was late to the colonial scramble and desperately seeking scraps in Morocco and the Middle East to feed its steel mills. Russia and Austria-Hungary, already fragile, were borrowing heavily just to hold their multi-ethnic empires together and pulling the strings, not kings or kaisers but merchant banks. The Rothschilds of London, Baring Brothers and Morgans of New York, lending at rates that would make a loan shark blush. By 1914, the global economy was a fragile web tied to the gold standard. Every nation's currency was backed by bullion. One hiccup in trade or tariffs and gold flowed out like blood from a wound. The imperial rivalries weren't just about prestige. They were economic lifelines. Britain's blockade of German ships in the North Sea wasn't a naval game. It was starvation by strategy, crashing Berlin's banks. And here's the mind-blower. These financial feuds didn't just make war possible, they funded it. JP Morgan's $500 million lifeline to the Allies nudged the US toward abandoning neutrality. Meanwhile, Germany scrambled to secure gold from its allies, desperate to keep its empire afloat. But did these bankers grasp the carnage they were enabling? Or was it just business as usual? The receipts tell a story far wilder than any battlefield. Let's start at the root. Imperialism wasn't a noble quest for glory. It was pure cash. By the late 1800s, European powers had carved up Africa like a Thanksgiving turkey. Britain controlled Egypt and South Africa for cotton and gold. France dug into China for rubber. Germany, late to the table, grabbed Tangana and Namibia for phosphates. Factories churned day and night, producing steel rails and rifles. But raw materials were crucial to fatten profits. Colonies offered cheap labor, captive markets, and resources shipped straight to Manchester or Berlin. Building these empires was expensive. Railways through jungles, forts in deserts, conflicts with local populations, all on government dimes, meaning big loans from private banks. By 1900, Britain owed billions in bonds, largely to five titans of London finance. Rothschilds wove web from Paris to Vienna. Baring Brothers were recovering from Argentina's debt fiasco. JP Morgan eyed Europe like a kid in a candy store. These weren't ordinary loans. They were collateralized by future colonial taxes. France's North African campaigns meant Parisian bankers sweating over Ottoman-style debt, effectively turning empires into ATMs. Germany, united in 1871, felt the squeeze hardest. Naval budgets soared while colonies like Togo barely paid for themselves. By 1913, Berlin's external debt reached 20 billion marks, funneled through Reichsbank and private houses like Deutsche Bank. Russia borrowed heavily from French banks to arm against the Ottomans, racking up 6 billion francs in bonds that made St. Petersburg a puppet of Parisian finance. It sounds like Monopoly run wild, right? But this debt pyramid was teetering. Tariffs spiked trade wars. Britain's naval blockade choked German exports. And one bad harvest or a rebellion in India could send the whole system into chaos. Kaiser Wilhelm II, wasn't he just paranoid about encirclement? He was staring at potential bankruptcy if Britain choked German access to African resources. And the banks, they thrived. More tension meant more loans, higher interest. By 1914, Europe's economy was a house of cards. Each king held a mortgage from the same lenders. How did this teetering financial system tip into total war? Enter the gold standard, the invisible handcuffs that turned rivalries into life or death gambles. Since the 1870s, major powers pegged currencies to gold. Pounds, marks, francs, all redeemable for fixed amounts. It kept trade smooth until it didn't. Gold was finite. Wars, famines, strikes, or trade disruptions drained reserves, triggering currency crises. Britain hoarded 40% of the world's bullion by 1914, thanks to South African and Australian colonies. Germany scraped by with partially empty Reichsbank vaults. When crises flared, like the 1911 Agadir incident in Morocco, gold fled banks, interest rates spiked, and credit for farmers and factories tightened. Imagine a Berlin baker unable to get a loan because the Kaiser's naval fleet drained reserves. Bread riots erupted. Unemployment surged. And the solution was more colonies for more gold. A zero-sum game. Secrets fueled the tension. Alliances weren't just handshakes. They were financial instruments wrapped in secrecy. Bismarck's 1887 reinsurance treaty with Russia promised neutrality if France attacked, kept hidden to avoid alarming Austria. The 1915 Treaty of London bribed Italy with Austrian and Albanian territories to switch sides with a secret $50 million loan and spoils. The Sykes-Picot Agreement carved Ottoman lands quietly, securing post-war oil fields for select powers. This wasn't diplomacy. It was venture capital for war with banks underwriting the bonds. Germany, largely boxed out, turned inward lending to Austria-Hungary, and grabbing 71% of their debt by 1918, stripping Vienna's gold vaults bare. Berlin funded Vienna's war machine while siphoning bullion to cover its own deficits. Millions marched to die, but it was the gold clerks in Frankfurt making the calls. Then one American banker stepped in with a loan so massive it not only funded the war, it forced a neutral giant to take sides. Boom, J.P. Morgan Jr., the Wall Street colossus who turned U.S. neutrality into a punchline. When war erupted in 1914, America was supposed to sit it out. Wilson preached peace. The public yawned. Morgan smelled profit. From day one, his firm became the Allies' personal shopper. $3 billion in munitions, food, steel, all funneled through J.P. Morgan & Co. as exclusive agents. That's over $80 billion today. One 1915 loan, $500 million to Britain and France, was the largest foreign bond issue ever. F.A. Rothschild branch in London wired funds to keep Paris afloat. Neutrality be damned. By 1916, Britain was financing everyone. Italy's full tab, 2/3 of France, and Russia's gold reserves drained. Overseas investments pawned. Private credit maxed. Morgan lobbied Wilson, warning that Allied collapse would tank U.S. exports. When the NY Committee investigated, they found America's hands were tied. Default on Morgan's loans meant economic Armageddon. So in 1917, doughboys shipped out not just for democracy, but to protect Wall Street's ledger. Germany tried to counter with secret gold shipments via the Ottomans, propping up Vienna with 3.5 billion marks in credits. It backfired. Reich's banknotes tripled. Inflation loomed. And central banks suspended gold convertibility, printing fiat like confetti. The war cost $28 billion. Taxes covered only a fraction, and bonds sold to patriotic citizens. Granny's kids lined the pockets of Morgan and Rothschild. Letters from the front spoke of mud and fallen comrades. Back home, boardrooms toasted victory loans. 16 million dead, empires shattered. But the financial web endured. The U.S. emerged as creditor king. London dethroned, but scheming. This wasn't chance. It was architecture. When the guns fell silent in 1918, ledgers didn't balance. They broke the world. Versailles wasn't peace. It was a debt trap chaining Germany to hyperinflation and eventually Hitler. That Sarvo bullet only the pretext. The real battle was fought in vaults, where gold trumped glory, and loans outlasted lives. Remember this the next time someone calls it the war to end all wars. It was the war that minted modern finance. The Rothschilds and Morgans didn't fire shots, but their ink drew maps of misery. And today you see its echoes in every sanctions tweet and IMF bailout. If this video gave you value, hit like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves this type of content.